Hi, everybody at the Data for Good Summit. I am Nick Conger. I am EPA's press secretary. And thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts today via video. I had planned to be addressing you all live virtually. Unfortunately, I've had some work obligations requiring me to travel this week, which precluded my ability to do this virtually. So thank you to Civis and to my friend Amanda Moss and to Patrice Brown for setting me up to share some thoughts via video from my childhood home here in upstate New York, where I'm visiting family for Memorial Day weekend. And I promise to keep this short and sweet because I know there are diminishing returns to these long-winded video messages. But I'll share some thoughts based on, my current role here at EPA, but also based on my past experience. I've worked in the nonprofit sector. I've worked at World Wildlife Fund and NRDC. I've worked in corporate sustainability, and I've had the incredible, unique pleasure of working with Al Gore, somebody who knows a thing or two about presenting data and scientific evidence in a compelling fashion. And so this is something that I have been attuned to for my whole career, really thinking through ways that we can communicate data and science in a compelling way that resonates with people. And so I think the first thing that I would say, the first takeaway, is that you have to couch data and science within a broader narrative and story that resonates with people. It's fine and good to have good data, but on its own, throwing numbers at people without that context, you really, I think, miss out on the opportunities for it to stick and for it to compel action with folks. That might not be the most earth-shattering thought, I realize, but we all kind of lose sight of it, I think, on a regular basis because, especially with an increased, I think, which is a good thing, an increased appreciation for science, especially in light of how we've coming out of the pandemic. Science is important, but it's not a silver bullet on its own. It needs to be connected to stories that matter. And so from this government's perspective, and I think this has been a bit of a narrative kind of development over the past few administrations, we've been really focused on telling stories about public health and connecting the climate crisis and environmental degradation to public health, both in terms of impacts and opportunities. And this is by no means to suggest that this should be at the exclusion of talking about the impacts on species and on protecting places that are under threat and increasingly degraded by the climate crisis and by pollution. And so we need to continue to do that, and that certainly is relevant based on certain audience profiles and certain forums that you're communicating in. But speaking strictly at this point from the government perspective and from this administration's perspective, we're increasingly focused on telling stories about how the climate crisis, how pollution affects public health. That's resonating with people we find more and more because it's tangible, it's real, it's everyday. And so we're doing that more and more in our communications efforts, using that framing. And I would also say that we need to talk about climate crisis and environmental degradation, both in terms of articulating the impacts on our lives, because that makes it urgent and it stresses the need for action, but it needs to be followed up shortly thereafter with solutions so that people don't feel helpless. Because they feel helpless, they start to look the other way, throw their arms up and say, this isn't solvable, and they just move on. And in many ways, that's a form of denial in and of itself. So very important to articulate both impacts followed closely by solutions. So in terms of impacts, I recommend folks thinking about developing data and implementing data in the context of how does it affect people's health. And so strictly on the climate lens, rising temperatures mean heat stress, especially in urban areas. What does that mean for increased hospitalizations, increased rates of mortality? You have broader pollution impacts that relate to climate, increase exposure to air toxics. What does that mean for asthma attacks? Increase incidence for asthma attacks for certain populations that are disadvantaged or underserved. These are compelling data points that can help show this is how we are impacted today by pollution and by the climate crisis, and this is why we need urgent action. You can also talk about the climate crisis through an economic lens. How does increased severity of extreme weather affect homeowners who live on coasts? What does that mean for insurance rates? What does that mean for property damage? What does increased volatility from extreme weather mean for rising gas prices, for instance? These are human, everyday, tangible examples that are a fine and good when we just say, hey, this affects your insurance rates or your gas prices, but it needs to be supported by data points that tell that story. So again, here is an example of articulating impact first and foremost. One last point on the impacts that I'll make, again, from the environmental justice lens, which obviously I hope you all recognize is a top priority for this administration. There are increased indicators for underserved communities that we're learning more and more about, and there's more and more data behind. So we talked about kind of heat and how that can be disproportionately burdensome for minority and low-income communities. But there's also drinking water concerns, aging infrastructure, lead seeping into children's drinking water, the effect that has on development and IQ, for instance. The Flint water crisis comes to mind, but we're coming across more and more examples of cities that have aging infrastructure with lead pipes that are corroding and seeping lead into children's drinking water. This is a extremely urgent environmental challenge that story needs to be told more and more. We think that is what helps motivate action, and it needs to be supported with data and evidence. And so if you can articulate and develop data that support how lead exposure is impacting children and their development, that is compelling. That generates traction. That generates action. Now, shifting into the important point about solutions. Again, we find it to be very important to be following up the public health impacts with solutions. And so a key frame for solutions we're finding is talking about it from an economic opportunity standpoint, that the cost of wind and solar continues to decline relative to the cost of coal-fired and fossil fuel-based energy. Telling those stories in a way, and what does that mean for communities? Does that mean increase opportunities for job creation, increase economic opportunities overall? Overall, telling these stories in clear, compelling, plain-spoken terms, supported by data, we found it goes a long way. And again, replacing lead pipes. What does it mean to replace lead pipes in communities? How will that affect children and their development and their health? Telling these stories, using data to support them, this is what I believe this administration is increasingly focused on, and I think that those are the kinds of stories that will resonate well. And I think that these can be applied for other sectors as well, beyond just the public sector. I think increasingly corporations are realizing that they have to take action, and that there's incredible economic opportunity. So again, talking about these messages and framed in a way that will resonate with the audience, corporate sector, increasingly economic opportunity in investing in wind and solar and other renewable technologies. The electric vehicle market continues to grow and grow. What are the economic opportunities there, etc. So all in all, I encourage you all to think about data connected to a broader narrative that resonates with people. We're increasingly focused on the public health frame as one that really resonates and that really generates traction, but also follow that up with solutions and how can you put data behind those solutions. Again, I'm sorry I'm not able to engage in a Q&A. I'm sure there would be lots of ground for fruitful discussion, but I appreciate the opportunity to provide some thoughts today, and I hope and look forward to future opportunities down the road.